Welcome, I'm Erik Twice, and today I'm going to talk about the history of Eurogames. I already had a conversation about this topic at the Ludo Ergo Sum convention last week. However, that discussion was only available in Spanish. Hence, I've decided to make this video so my English-speaking audience can also listen to it. Don't expect a deep historical dive. This is a casual talk. My goal is less to tell you exactly how Eurogames came to be and what their history is, than it is to present my view of it and perhaps raise your curiosity on how the games we play came to be. I hope you enjoy it. If you have been playing board games for a while, you might have heard the term Eurogames. In fact, some of your favorite games might be Eurogames. And yet, despite being a quite common term that you can hear everywhere, from your local games group to Board Game Geek, you might not be so sure what an Eurogame is. After all, quite different games are given that label. For example, you might have heard that term when it comes to Catan. Catan is held by some as the stereotypical Eurogame. It's a resource management game with a bit of negotiation and pretty much the most popular hobby board game we can now play. However, the label is also given to games like Citadels, which are much smaller, full of conflict and bluffing, and which really don't resemble Catan much. In fact, if you spend your time with very heavy gamers, who really love playing and meeting together, Eurogames may not even refer to Catan or Citadels, but games like Kanban, which are complex and heavy and very much not like your average family would play. So, it's natural to be confused. What really is an Eurogame? Well, I can tell you what they are not. Eurogames are not a genre. Genre in board games, or gaming in general, tend to be separated by their mechanics. Hence we have first-person shooters, we have platformers, we have auction games, we have negotiation, cooperatives, dice games. All these genres are different when it comes to mechanics, and we can find Eurogames in many of those genres. For example, out of the selection I've chosen here, we have Pandemic, which is a cooperative game, Pico Pico, which is a dice game, mostly for children. We have a heavy economic game, such as Steam, an abstract game in the style of Go, in Through the Desert, and even a pure negotiation game where everything's for sale in Genoa. So, Eurogames cannot be a genre because they already cover different genres. Hence, we might wonder, if they are not a genre, then what are they? I contend that Eurogames are a style or artistic movement. In this way, we can compare games, to cinema or paintings or any other art form who already have artistic movements. That is, Eurogames could be compared to Italian neorealism, the artistic movement that gave us physical thieves, or it can be compared to blockbusters of the 70s and 80s, the movies of Steven Spielberg and George Lucas. If you stretch it a little, it can be like Cubism or the pop art of the 60s. All tendencies, all artistic movements, all styles have roughly three characteristics. The first one is that they have a common philosophy. They have roughly the same ideas. And even though they are made by several designers, they share some of those ideas in common. And this is not just a one-time thing. It's not just one day that people need to create this kind of games. It's a movement. It takes place over a period of time, often years and maybe even decades. I believe Eurogames fit the bill in this regard, and they could be considered yet another artistic movement in what I consider an art form, for I consider games to be just that, an art form. Like all art movements, Eurogames didn't grow out of thin air. They have predecessors, and this predecessor, in the case of Eurogames, was the German mass market, just after World War II. That's still a bit inaccurate, though. After all, Germany was divided into 4 regions. We had Western Germany, Eastern Germany, Berlin, and the Republic of Saarland. So, when I say Germany in this talk, at least before reunification in 1991, I mostly mean Western Germany. Still, many of the concepts and ideas and the overall culture of playing games is common to the whole of Germany, both in the past and to this day. After World War II, Germany was destroyed. However, in the 1950s, there was an economic miracle, and Germany grew to be one of the industrial powerhouses of Europe. This also meant people had a new need for entertainment, entertainment that was cheap and that could be played with others. Many of the games we normally associate with board games, or that at least the average Joe on the street does, came from this time. I'm thinking of games like Scrabble, Risk, Clue, Diplomacy, Stratego. All these games were released in the 40s and 50s, and they will go on to be some of the most influential games ever released. Even then, the arrival of board games wasn't new. Germany, like most countries of Europe, already had a very strong culture of playing cards. Like here in Spain, it's common to meet with your family and your friends to play games like Skat or Doppelkopf, just for fun. This meant that there were many people who already met to play games. They might be games very different from the games you usually play. But they are still games, and the people playing them are still gamers who are willing to try new things. And this creates a fertile ground for newer games and newer designs that take gaming in a different direction. It's easy to forget that these games, that now might seem poor or old-fashioned to our eyes, used to be at the forefront of game design. They were extremely influential, and their influence can still be felt today. For example, take Clue. Games like Cryptid and The Search for Planet X owed much to it. Of course, in Clue, you move around the board and ask questions to try to solve a murder. When you think about it, it's not that different from asking clues to see where a mysterious animal is or where a planet could be. It's the same principle. We can even see this influence in games that have very little to do with Eurogames, like HeroQuest. HeroQuest is a game where you take a barbarian and punch down the forces of evil, and yet when you look at the board, you might be surprised to find that the map is very much like Clues. Even new designs like Alchemist that are app-driven and use modern technology owe a lot to Clue and all these old games that may not be the best today. There's a second set of influences, and those are what I call the pioneers. The pioneers are a set of designers whose work was very advanced for their time. In fact, many of their games are still great to play today. I'm thinking of Zig Saxon, creator of Acquire, Olotka, Everly and Keith Rich, most well known for Cosmic Encounter, and Francis Tresham, the designer of Civilization and 1830. It may be strange to think that one of the crown jewels of the Americas movement, like Dune or perhaps Cosmic Encounter, were key influences into Eurogames, and yet, when you look a bit into them, it's hard not to see why. These designers and their games introduced many concepts which are still used today. For example, the concept of asymmetric player powers, which each player has a different side of a different faction with unique powers, was pioneered in Cosmic Encounter. Games like Acquire are really similar to the cube rail games we see today. And Civilization not only spawned a lot of imitators, but is also one of the key influences in Catan and even in Bonanza by Uwe Rosenberg. Still, Eurogames wouldn't came to be as we recognize them until the 80s and 90s. Catan was an obvious turning point for the movement. It was the most popular title, introducing millions, both in Germany and outside of it, to the wider world of board games. And yet, I don't feel fine saying that Catan was the start of Eurogames. After all, many of the games we would call Eurogames today already existed before Catan. For example, Rainier Nisia already designed modern art in 1992. We can even go farther back to games like Heinrich & Co. or The Maker, which could be argued to be Eurogames. Personally, I say the date for the start of Eurogames in 1988. But, in order to know why, we need to look at another important characteristic of Eurogames. One of the key characteristics of Eurogames is that they are designer games. That is, they are games in which an author is the creative force behind the project, very much like writers, directors, or musicians are the creative force behind novels, songs, and movies. In fact, they are often professional designers who work in the field and may even make a living out of it. At least they try to. This is a huge change from the prevailing in-house style that companies such as Hasbro, MB, or Parker had. And it puts the author, that is the designer, at the forefront. It's about their games, not the games of the publisher. This is why I put the beginning of Eurogames as an artistic movement in 1988. That year, a group of designers, led by Reinhold Wittig, took a key step in securing their worker rights. They all agreed by signing on a coaster, a beer coaster, the kind that you put your drink on, that they will not sell any of their games to any publisher if their names aren't on the cover. This is a huge step in labor rights, and it secures game designers, especially board game designers, as artists worth recognizing as much as writers, movie directors, or musicians. It is a key step for Eurogames and probably the single biggest influence Eurogames will ever have on the medium. The third characteristic of Eurogames is that they are directed to the family market, at least at first. Here we have a typical German family, the kind you will see if you go to Aldi. And this family likes to play games. This means that the games they play must be good for children, but most importantly, also for adults. After all, when I say family market, I just don't mean playing with younger members of the family. I also mean playing with friends, with older relatives, with other couples. That is, instead of meeting and playing cards, you may end up playing modern art or playing El Grande, Catan, any of these new Euro games that are a very good fit for families. Why the family market? Well, very easy. It was the market that already existed. Like we have seen, there were already games like Scrabble or Bridge or Monopoly that people met to play. The people playing games and that you could sell your games to were families. Families, understood quite broadly, but still families. The nerd market for people who like Star Wars and Star Trek and fantasy fiction will come much later. So far, we have seen characteristics of Eurogames that don't really relate to the game design. However, that doesn't mean that game design is not an important part of Eurogames. In fact, I will claim that the focus on mechanics and game design is one of the most important characteristics of Eurogames. And above all, they focus on elegance. Elegance simply means to get more with less. That is to have a game that is easy to play, that is simple, that doesn't have many rules or exceptions, but that can deliver a strong experience, that has depth, that is fun. In many ways, this relates to the previous concept. After all, games must be accessible for families. If the game is too long, too complex, or too nerdy, a family won't be able to play it. This is why Eurogames tend to have a far shorter length than used to be common back in the day. A game on Risk can take the whole evening. A Eurogame? Probably not. And the rules are simpler than many other games of the era, like Avalon Hill war games. In many ways, Eurogames strive to improve on what came before them. Those classics like Risk, Monopoly, and Clue are pretty flawed games. They don't hold interest for long, their strategy is lacking, and random factors and chance can ruin a game. That is, Eurogames bring modern German design principles into board games. After all, the focus is also on creating games for adults, not just games that you can gamble your money with or play children with. Now that we have seen these characteristics of Eurogames, let's see how they bear out in practice. I think Eurogames are very focused on decision making. That's it. It's the act of playing that is given importance. Trying to make games for adults and trying to improve on the design of other games also means that much more attention is paid to the actions you take in the game, how you actually play them. Normally, older games didn't really pay that much attention to them. The focus was on just playing with other people, or gambling, or playing with children, so they might have not been the best or most polished in that sense. We will see a much higher importance of strategy and perhaps the social aspects, or even the overall experience and feeling of the games, is not quite as important as simply how you play. One of the ways this new design principle manifests is in very little randomness. Many Eurogames don't even feature any random factors at all. This doesn't mean that Eurogames don't use dice, or don't have random factors, or that they can't be highly random. It's just heavily limited compared to games that came before. Again, this makes sense. You can lose a game of Risk or Monopoly or any of the older games from the 50s just because you were unlucky. And the same goes with playing cards. Many of the games, like poker, have a pretty high random factor because you are supposed to gamble with them. That's part of their appeal. But since hero games are far more focused on the act of playing, on decision making, randomness is reevaluated and no longer seen as necessary. This is why Eurogames tend to feature very little of it or try to compensate it in other ways. But perhaps the broader aspect of Eurogame design is the search for a stable experience. Picture the following. You are meeting with your family to play Risk. You turn up to your cousin and say, "Cousin, our grandma is a menace to this earth. We have to wipe her out of the map and prevent her from having any fun whatsoever." So you group together and you attack grandma who is winning and you knock her out of the game and she's no longer playing. She's no longer having fun, she's no longer interacting. That's a risk you take, pun intended, with this kind of games. But it can lead to sore problems. Perhaps grandma doesn't take to losing too well. Perhaps people attack each other when they shouldn't. Or just people keep talking and negotiation goes on forever. Eurogames take steps to create an experience that is more controlled, more stable. For example, when you interact with other players, you don't just punch them in the face. There's normally a mechanic in the middle that says, okay, you can interact with them, but only through an action. Or you may be able to trade, but only certain items. You cannot trade everything. This is a way of creating games that are just better for families and better for adults who don't have the time to get good at a 6-hour game. We can really see a lot of this influence in modern designs, even though it's not always said out loud. it can be a very large part of the experience. I remember, for example, designer Uwe Rosenberg, who once said in an interview that strategy and war cannot coexist in games with 3 or more players. That is, he didn't believe that you could have any strategy in a game if someone could come and attack you. They will wreck your strategy with your interaction. This is not often said out loud, but I believe it's a strong undercurrent in the way Eurogames are designed. Lastly, Eurogames are known for looking quite serious. You won't find any happy German families having a jolly good time together on the covers of a Eurogame. The idea is to separate the newer Eurogames from the old children's games that adults were tired of. They try to appear more mature, to look more like something adults would be interested in playing. For better or worse, the frowny king on the cover of Kalos is a way to give permission to adults to play board games without having the fear of being judged as childish. There's also an avoidance of any topic that could offend or cause controversy in Germany. For example, war. Germany has a huge military history. It is said that Prussia was born out of a cannonball, or that it wasn't a state with a big army, but a big army that just somehow got itself a state. And as you can imagine, after World War II, these kinds of topics were controversial. Just imagine yourself going, Oma, Oma, do you remember that war that was in? I bought this game called Panzerblitz to play with them. Obviously, that isn't going to go very well. Kriegspiels, or games about war, are just one of the topics that are taboo in board games, at least initially. Rather, Eurogames tend to focus on history and topics that are very distant both in time and space. This is why we get games based on the exploration era or ancient times. There's a practical reason for this. History is a topic that everyone is acquainted with. Everyone knows what a king or the Egyptians were and can plan accordingly. Compare this to earlier topics such as terraforming Mars. Few people know what terraforming is or what life on Mars will entail. It is much easier, much accessible, and in the end, better for a family audience to cover topics that they already know, hence history, most of the time distant history. There are topics that do not relate, at least directly, with German politics. We have to remember, Germany was only reunified in 1991. And to this day, Germans have a collective guilt for the Nazi past of their country. Grande is fine if it's set in Spain. If it was set during the age of the Holy Roman Empire, that could be a bit controversial. And also, Eurogames tend to be apolitical. Unlike punk or futurism, they don't really have a political goal. First, board games are seen as mere entertainment. They are not seen as a tool that can provide political ideas. And second, it's an attempt to avoid controversy. Your grandma or your father probably has very different politics from you, and you don't want to fight, you want to have fun and distract yourself from a very difficult political situation. Of course, this doesn't mean that there are no political implications to Eurogames. While Puerto Rico might seem like a distant topic to Germans, it certainly is not a distant topic to the people who live there. The games we have covered so far may be quite different from the games you play now. There's a reason for that. Eurogames, like any artistic movement, evolves over time. And I believe that all the characteristics we have seen so far refer to what I call the classic period of Eurogames, the beginning of Eurogames, at the point in which those characteristics were the most important. After many years, Eurogames were incredibly successful, so much, in fact, that their ideas became part of board games themselves in the same way that the classic Hollywood era of cinema became a part of cinema as a whole. In later years, Eurogames will change and they will enter what I call their Baroque period. Why Baroque? Because it comes later than Classicism and is far more ornate. During this period, we start to see how Eurogames become fused with other currents in board games. For example, Chaos in the Old World is not a typical Eurogame. It's not a family game. It's a game about pestilence and war and gods that fight each other, a high fantasy game with a lot of conflict. And yet, it has very Euro mechanics. The reason for this is that we will see more and more games not made for a family audience, but made for hobbyists, people who play games for their own sake. This is a very important change that will drive game design. Hobbyists have very different needs and very different ideas of what games should be like than a family audience. In practice, this means that the complexity of Eurogames and the games they fuse with is going to change, is going to be increased significantly. Consider all the games I've shown here. Most of these games could easily be considered Eurogames. However, they are quite different from the games we have seen before. Again, we have Terraforming Mars, which has a topic which is quite nerdy. It's not the kind of game you would really play with your family. It's a bit too complex, it's a bit too long, and it's a bit too inward looking. We'll even see games like Food Chain Magnate, which are just too difficult, complex, and involved to play with a family. They are games for people who have played many games. We also start to see games that straddle the line between what is an Eurogame and what is not. 1812, The Invasion of Canada, is a perfect example. It is a war game, a topic we have seen is taboo in Eurogames. And yet, it's not a war game in the tradition of Avalon Hill. Rather, it's a Eurogame in the tradition of El Grande, just with a different topic. We'll also see pure conflict games like Brad's Rage, absurd mechanics from Eurogames like drafting and area control. Even crowns duels of the Ameritrash movement like Twilight Imperium became more like an Eurogame as time went on. The first edition of Twilight Imperium was a pure war game. You attack each other and the goal was to exterminate other players, pretty much like Risk. Now, over time, with the second, third, and now fourth edition, it became more and more like an Eurogame. It got drafting, it got victory points, and now it can be considered a hybrid between the two. One of my favorite critics, Michael Barnes, once wrote a fantastic article called The Game That Ruined Eurogames, in which he covered all this difference between what I call the classic and Baroque periods of games, or at least some of the most negative aspects of them. According to him, the Princess of Florence had changed how Euros worked. Now Euros were less focused on interaction between players. For example, in which in a classic Euro would separate players with a mechanic, now not even a mechanic will be between players at all. They just simply won't be able to interact as much as they used to. This gave rise to the multiplayer solitaire games we see today, where you kind of play with others, but the interaction and the presence of other players is extremely minor. In the Princess of Florence, each player has its own board, so you don't quite interact as often because you have your own stretch of map. You don't need to fight with others as much. These are kind of games, like he says, that are made for hobbies, and hobbies which are influenced by the internet. If you look for board game on the internet, on Google or any other search engine, you are going to get Board Game Geek. And Board Game Geek isn't really representative of the wider player base or really anyone. It is a niche American website, and yet it has a very large influence in how games are made today. There is a focus, like he mentions, on conservatism. The idea is less to innovate like all heroes did, but simply to improve what already exists. After all the ground has already been broken. The idea is just to improve and create games that hobbyists will like. Make them deeper, make them more complex, make them a bit less interactive, because as a rule of thumb, Eurogamers don't really like that. This gave rise to what we call boutique games, which are small games that may sell 2, 3, 10,000 copies, and that aim for a very specific audience. You no longer play a game that is representative of a whole mechanic. You play games that have, for example, worker placement and an auction. And if you don't like auction, you can play another game, which is a worker placement game that has cards. But for me, an important change that Michael doesn't cover is that there are more designers and more players which are not European. And as you can imagine, this is going to be a very important cultural change. Many of the games we have seen before wouldn't be made by Germans for Germans. For example, Germans are not interested in a war game about how Canada was conquered. In my mind, this new era of Eurogames, the Baroque era, is part of the reason why so many people believe that Eurogames is a genre focused on resource management. It's not far-fetched. It's just that as time went on, Eurogames became more and more synonymous with that narrow style. But we are no longer on that Baroque era anymore. I roughly consider the Baroque era to last 15 years at best. I think we have now entered a new era, which I'm going to call the Rococo era of Eurogames. Why? Because it was the style that followed the Baroque era, and which has many similarities with the games that are being made today. They are, after all, far more ornate than anything that came before, and perhaps also more consumeristic. The reason I feel we are reaching the end of the Eurogames movement is that the principles that gave it birth are no longer as relevant. We have new influences that are replacing them. For example, the influence of video games. We have games like Clank, which is an adaptation from League of Legends, a video game, and it's published and made by a video game company. Now the forefront of game design isn't found on the mass market. The most influential designs are on Kickstarter, another crowdfunding platform. The way of deluxe products and games costing 90, 100, even 200 euros that we see today didn't start on Germany or the family market. It started on Kickstarter. And in fact, all these platforms weren't even available in Europe until quite recently. Above all, I think we are seeing the influence of brands into the hobby. As board games have become bigger and more profitable, we are seeing more and more companies interested in licensing their brands to create board games. The best example of this is Funko Pop. Their whole business model is based on taking branded property from films and making board games out of them. Their games might be Euro games in a strict sense. They have Euro mechanics, but the mechanics are not important. The importance is on the brand. In fact, the brand is so strong that Funko Pop Games does not credit their designers. And they are not the only ones. While Clank has a credited designer, his name is not on the cover. And it's hard to argue that people are buying games for their author when they buy brand new games on Kickstarter because they have miniatures. Eurogames have changed. Now the biggest change in board games do not come from Europe or the family market or anything related to classic Euros. Think about this. The biggest board game publisher in the world, Asmodee, was bought by a video game company, the Embracer Group. Now Nerd Media is in fashion. and we see very large convention, a lot of money, and a far bigger presence than it ever had. And more people play Eurogames. Europe and Germany, obviously, aren't even the main target anymore. It is hard for me to argue that all these changes are not making Eurogames less relevant as an artistic movement. Now, this doesn't mean that Eurogames will cease to exist, or that we will no longer see games like Catan or Agricola or Steam. But it means their influence is going to be felt less and less as time goes on. After all, no artistic movement lasts forever. There used to be a time in which westerns were the most important genre in cinema. Movies like Stagecoach were so important their presence can still be felt today in modern cinema. And yet, nobody will say that westerns are at the forefront of cinema right now. Now the focus is on franchises and superhero movies. And those movies may even be on their way out. Eurogames may have a beginning, and we may be close to their end, but they will always have a presence. Like Western movies, Eurogames are past their artistic prime. However, this doesn't mean they won't be influencing the hobby, or that they won't be brought back in the future in a different form like it happened with so many artistic movements. I'm really glad to be able to share this discussion with you in English, even if it's not as polished as I would like it to. In the end, the reason I do this is that I want people to consider games more broadly, to know where they come from, what they are, and what they could be. Thank you.